There seems to be growing work in the area of anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion across organizations and institutions. As an example, a recent report looked at diversity and leadership across Canadian public companies. The report indicated that more than two-thirds of the time, TSX-listed companies have adopted a written board diversity policy, and approximately 90% of the time, those policies included a specific focus on women on the board. Also, right here in our city, there are anti-racism initiatives targeted at challenging systemic barriers, such as Edmonton's Anti-Racism Advisory Committee, Edmonton's Anti-Racism Strategy, and Alberta's Anti-Racism Advisory Council. So I wanted to speak to someone with significant research work in the area of diversity and inclusion to better understand how organizations actually interpret and implement diversity and inclusion. And this is where Dr. Miroro Ziyemba comes in. Dr. Miroro Ziyemba is an educator and post-secondary leader who is committed to leadership for social justice and equity. She is the Dean of the Faculty of Skills and Foundational Learning at Northwest College in Edmonton. As the Dean, she provides strategic academic and operational leadership for a faculty that serves thousands of adult learners. She is the recipient of Caroline Dillman Award for Innovation in the field of language training. She is also the recipient of the Stevens Commerce Bibliotherapy and Reading Educator Award. In addition to her role in post-secondary leadership, Dr. Ziyemba has special interest in, has facilitated lectures on, and has conducted research in the areas of equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, and decolonization in education. Now, who better to chat with me about the interpretation of diversity and inclusion in organizations than with Dr. Ziyemba? Dr. Ziyemba is perhaps the first female Black dean in a top community college in Alberta. This is the untold story of Dr. Miroro Ziyemba.
The successes on the road to leadership. I started off my career as an ESL instructor, so that's teaching English as a second language. And then moved on to becoming an associate chair in the language training department. And I felt that perhaps leadership was my calling. And I then moved on to become the chair of the program. And shortly after, became the associate dean in the language training department, and then switched faculties and became associate dean as well in the Faculty of Business, Environment and Technology, and recently was appointed dean in the Faculty of Skills and Foundational Learning, where again I have the opportunity to serve thousands of learners, taking academic upgrading, language training, settlement courses, teaching English as additional language, so very rewarding in that sense. There are always challenges when you get involved, especially when one decides to engage leadership. I think my one challenge that I faced a few years ago now, I had been appointed, or rather become the associate chair, and I had a colleague come up to me shortly after the announcement. Of course, I was very happy and proud of myself. But I had a colleague who came up to me and said, well, congratulations, well done, but you know why they selected you, right? And I'm like, well, right. And I went through the interview, I was successful. She says, well, you know why they selected you, right? And she pointed to her skin, but referring to the color of my skin. And that's when it dawned on me that, the perception is that I was selected because I was Black. And after that, she says, well, and also, you're young, right? You're young, so they want young Black female leaders. I thanked her for her observations and walked away. Because at that point, to be honest, DJ, I was conflicted. I didn't know what to feel or how to react. I did not expect this. I mean, later on, a few years later, I was able to talk about this with my supervisor at that time, jokingly in terms of just as a story, right, as a narrative. But it stayed with me in that as one engages these leadership roles, there is that perception, right? Are you actually fit for the job? Or the question of who can be a leader, who's perceived as a leader. And so I felt that, or perhaps that perception was I've been appointed simply because of the color of my skin and not necessarily because of my qualifications or what I bring to the table. So those are some of the challenges. Just kind of shared with you in one particular example, but that is something that follows one throughout that journey. And I, came to realize that I'm not the only one who has been challenged in that way or asked these kind of questions. As I engaged in my own research for my doctoral, I read the stories of other leaders, people of color who, in one way or another, were asked kind of similar questions. And at the end, some very interesting articles that have been written on who is a leader or who can be a leader or perceived as a leader. What do the words or the values diversity and inclusion mean? And in my case, post secondary settings, simply because that's the world in which I work, that's the world in which I interact with a number of people, and particularly students. And I'll tell you how I came to that question. Um, as a leader, post-secondary leader, I have the privilege and honor of sitting on the stage at convocation, right, watching the graduates march across the stage, get their diplomas, and out in the audience, their family, excited, clapping for them, celebrating this academic achievement. So it's quite an event to attend convocation. But so because I am a leader, I get to sit on the stage. So right behind, the president of the college and the VPs, and clap and wish everybody well. And so I could not help but notice, of course, that the graduates, right, especially in many community colleges, come from such diverse backgrounds. And here, when I use the word diverse backgrounds, I'm referring to those visible aspects of diversity, for example, such as race, or in some cases somebody's religious background, depending on their on their dress, gender, for example. So those visible characteristics. There was a really big gap or difference between those who were sitting behind the stage, like myself, in other words, the leaders of the institution, and then those students who were marching across the stage. And so I thought, why is that? When I looked around myself, and I thought at that time, uh, there weren't many leaders like me, or who looked like me, in other words, who were black. At one point, there was one other, and then that person left, and somebody else came. But at the end of the day, really very little representation that mirrored the student demographic. So those are questions that started coming to my mind as to why is it that I find that I'm alone or at this table in many ways. And so when the opportunity came up for me to do some research, that was my research question. I wanted to understand how post-secondary leaders understand diversity and inclusion. You will recall a few years ago we had that huge incident, very unfortunate, the murder of George Floyd in the United States. At that time, I was actually asking myself these diversity and equity inclusion questions. And then this happened in the States. And as you recall, it just shook all of North America, right? There were demonstrations, there were, uproar, all of that. And what was interesting was that a number of organizations, post secondaries included, all across North America, responded in solidarity, of course, with saying in their responses, they all stated how they were committed to diversity and inclusion. And so I thought, okay, a man has just been murdered. Why are we talking diversity and inclusion and not talking about racism and anti-racism? Where is the gap here? Or am I the only one who's seeing things differently or just not understanding what's going on? So that also informed my research question, made it even more kind of powerful. I wanted to understand, how do leaders make meaning of diversity and inclusion? Because I see it differently. What do my colleagues think? What do other leaders think? So that's when I engaged in this research, and I found that there are limitations with the words diversity and inclusion. And those limitations really result in that D&I becomes more of just performative, like lip service. And so changes don't actually happen. The words diversity, inclusion, some researchers say are feel good words. It feels good to be able to say we value diversity and inclusion. And so those statements make it okay to say we value diversity and inclusion. But the question is, what is actually structurally changing to reflect that? So I did say your question is so broad. We would narrow it takes days to go through it, but that was just kind of broad background to some of those challenges now with diversity and inclusion, how it has been defined, how companies are using and organizations refer to these values, but not actually talk about systemic injustices or structural inequalities, inequities, which, if addressed, would actually result in inclusivity and equity. What the research says, what I found in my research, so I engaged some post-secondary leaders from 3 different large institutions in the province to get their thoughts on these values, to get their thoughts on how they define diversity and inclusivity and what they think could lead to inclusivity and equity in post-secondary situations, institutions. And so what I found was that for there to be action for inclusivity and equity to actually be implemented, there is a need for individuals, in my case, in this research, for leaders, so we'll focus on leaders first, to really engage and have that self-reflexivity first within themselves of their understanding of social justice issues. So I'm going to move away from diversity here because, as I mentioned earlier, there are limitations with the words diversity. Let's actually name what it is. What is it that we're dealing with? So I'll use the broader term of social justice. And within social justice, you're going to get, for example, racism, coming in. And so we're looking at anti-racism. You're going to get homophobic activities, behaviors. So now we're looking at anti-homophobia. So whatever that issue may be, I will put that under the umbrella of social justice. So leaders need to understand for themselves at a personal level how they orient toward these issues. What is your positioning on, let's say, anti-racism, for example? How do you as an individual make meaning of that? So we all bring to the table our own personal historical experiences, our own ways of engaging with these issues. Are you aware of your own biases, for example? And so when one engages in that self-reflexivity on these issues, only then can one either question their activities, their actions, and how they interact with other people around them. So we have the personal dimension. There's a need for reflection there. And that moves to then interacting with others, like you and I talking now. That's an, interpersonal communication. What is happening there? I need to be aware that EJ has her ways of understanding racism, for example. And together, how do we make meaning of that in our workplace? From there, you move on to the communal setting. Now we're moving into the classrooms, for example. If you're a teacher, how are you engaging issues of racism within the curriculum, the materials you're using, the teaching methods you engage, the students who are in front of you. So if you see there, move from the personal to the interpersonal to the communal, and then moving on to the systemic. For you to be able to engage the curriculum as a system, for you to be able to engage the structures in an institution, whether it's the way in which we admit students, whether it's the ways in which we address issues of student judicial affairs or the students' union. Now we're moving to the systemic dimension. In what ways are we promoting or perpetuating any injustices? You have to start from the personal, moving out. And then from that systemic dimension, you then move into that ecological, now beyond the institution to the, in this case, the province in which we live in. What factors, what forces are there that are placed on leaders that they have to work with daily in order to make these decisions? Is it funding for post-secondary institutions? Is what's happening there that they have to look at, and does that promote equity? So it starts from the individual moving out into the system. So when we can have critical approaches, when we can ask ourselves critically, by critically really thinking of who is included, who has been excluded, which ways are we using to define? And what my research shows is really in this province, like many provinces and places around the world, we really have a white, Western, Eurocentric way of approaching education. So our systems are set up in that way. So when you think of it in that sense, then are those ways inclusive of other ways of knowing, such as Indigenous ways of knowing? And I use Indigenous here because we have the Indigenous peoples of Canada who have been here for years, whose histories have been erased through colonialism. So as leaders, we need to look at ways to decolonize our ways of working, our ways of thinking in our systems, for there to be some equity and inclusivity. That's a serious limitation that we come across or we engage, especially in the work of EDI. Because at least in some settings, post-secondary settings or educational settings, we do not collect race-based data as it is right now. Starting to hear of some organizations on their own just trying to collect that, but really collectively, we don't have that data. And so at the beginning of our interview, if you recall, you, in introducing me, you said, perhaps the first Black dean at the college, and perhaps because we actually haven't collected that kind of data. So anecdotally, this is quite the possibility that this is the position I am in. Without a shared understanding of the issue or the problem we are trying to resolve, I think we're going to keep going round in circles. So defining what diversity means, what inclusion means. The research shows us there's just so many definitions of diversity. It has been conceptualized in many ways, different ways. Same thing with inclusion or inclusivity. And so to resolve or to be able to have policies in place, strategies in place that really might lead to true inclusion and equity, we need a shared understanding. So organizations would have to, people at those organizations come to the table and define as an institution, how are we defining diversity and inclusion? And based on those definitions, then moving forward, developing strategic plans, policies that then support inclusivity in those contexts. Without that shared understanding, diversity and inclusion really become just statements that are pasted on websites and social media for people to feel good. Representation is important, absolutely. And so looking at an organizational perspective, perhaps institutions, organizations need to revisit their hiring and recruitment processes. Question how they are looking at people expressing an interest, responding to the job advertisements, In what ways are organizations evaluating the resumes? What lens? So if you remember, I talked about how really our structures are, kind of based on that Eurocentric lens. And so the ways in which I found DJ, also my experiences, African women, Black women, a number of diverse groups actually share their resumes or their skills and knowledge really differs. And so it depends on who is reading that resume, who is looking at it, are they interpreting certain information there. So in our hiring and recruitment processes, organizations need to revisit that and see how they can interpret those expressing an interest differently, invite them to this table. Some organizations have gone as far as actively recruiting, and I'll use just Black women as an example, or women in STEM. Looking at those the sciences, so to actively say we want women to join our organization or this project or whatever that may be, versus just looking at it from meritocracy to say, well, this is an equal competition, it's open to all, because we know the level of the playing field is not equal, is not level. So there has to be that active involvement, active recruitment of diverse groups, and in this case, Black women. For there to be meaningful change in institutions and organizations, there is need to have diverse voices at the table. And not just a voice, but a voice that has power behind it, because it boils down to power. And by power, I mean, are these voices that have the power to make decisions in that institution? So whatever level that may be, I'll go back to myself as an example. Now in this position as a dean, I am in a position where deans across institutions have the power to make decisions for their faculties. And so there needs to be more of that, the representational diversity, for there to be some meaningful change in organizations. And I want to add, EJ, on a more kind of a personal note, perhaps, as a last word or thought, that for women, and in this case I'm going to speak to Black women like myself, that for there to be these kind of changes in organizations, institutions, we need to take the step forward. It's not easy. It can be scary. It can be daunting. But somebody has to take that step and start working on some of these issues to make sure that those voices are at the decision-making table.
A true educator at heart and champion for equity, Dr. Ziyemba is the founder of a bursary that supports female entrepreneurs to complete their educational journey in Zimbabwe. The bursary was named to honor the memory and entrepreneurial spirit of her maternal grandmother, who broke gender inequity and racial barriers in colonial Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. From her grandmother, Dr. Ziyemba inherited her work ethic and activism for equity and inclusivity. Dr. Ziyemba is currently working on a book publication with the publisher Peter Lang on her research project entitled Diversity and Inclusivity: Implications for Leaders in the Post-Secondary Context. She currently serves as a co-sponsor of the Anti-Racism Working Group on the Reimagine Higher Education Strategy at Northwest College.